That's perfectly valid if it's just for entertainment. If you can entertain and educate, that's better. And if you can entertain, educate, and elevate.
He is one of the last true movie stars Hollywood ever built. An Oscar winner, a box office king, a man who once commanded $25 million for a single film. But for nearly 2 decades, Mel Gibson has also been one of the industry's most polarizing figures, a man whose career has been defined as much by scandal as by success. This is the story of how a late-night drive down a California highway turned a Hollywood golden boy into a cautionary tale, and how, against every prediction, he clawed his way back. Malcolm Saul Gerard Gibson was born on January 3, 1956, in Peekskill, New York, the 6th of 11 children. His father, Hutton Gibson, worked the railroads before an on-the-job injury changed the family's fortunes. A lawsuit settlement worth well over $100,000 gave Hutton the means to do something drastic. In 1968, he packed up his enormous family and moved them to New South Wales, Australia. 12-year-old Mel had never set foot there before, but the move wasn't purely financial. With the Vietnam War draft looming over his older sons, Hutton wanted his boys as far from American conscription as possible. Australia became home, and it was there, at St. Leo's Catholic College, that a shy, awkward teenager began to find his footing. Nobody in the family expected an acting career. Gibson has said for years that he stumbled into drama school almost by accident, encouraged by a sibling to apply. He enrolled at Sydney's National Institute of Dramatic Art, sharing scenes with a young Judy Davis and, in one memorably strange production, playing the fairy Queen Titania in an experimental staging of A Midsummer Night's Dream. When he graduated in 1977, nothing about his early paychecks suggested stardom. His film debut, Summer City, paid him $400. Later that same year, an Australian production company cast him as the lead in a gritty, low-budget action film called Mad Maximum. His fee was $9,000. Nobody involved could have guessed it would become one of the most influential action franchises in film history, or that it would launch its unknown star toward Hollywood. Gibson's family background is worth dwelling on for a moment because it shaped so much of what came later. Hutton Gibson was a devout, traditionalist Catholic with famously rigid and controversial religious views that would resurface decades later whenever critics tried to explain his son's public statements. Mel's mother, Anne, came from Longford, Ireland, and the family's Irish Catholic identity ran deep enough that Mel's own unusual middle names were drawn directly from Irish saints. There was also a theatrical streak buried in the family tree. One grandmother had been an opera singer, but nothing about young Mel's upbringing pointed toward Hollywood. He has described himself in interviews as an awkward, unremarkable teenager who fell into acting almost by chance after a sibling suggested he audition for drama school, mostly because he had no better plan for what to do after finishing school. Even after Mad Max, Gibson didn't leap into fame. He kept working in Australian theatre, sharing a cramped apartment in Adelaide with Robin Moore, the woman who would become his first wife. He took whatever roles came his way, including a part as a mentally disabled young man in the film Tim, and guest spots on Australian television. It wasn't until the mid-1980s that America started paying attention, first with the drama The River opposite Sissy Spacek, then with a string of films that built his reputation as a serious actor willing to take risks. The role that changed everything arrived in 1987. Martin Riggs, the unhinged, suicidal cop in Lethal Weapon. The film was a massive hit, and Gibson, almost overnight, became one of the biggest stars on the planet. The years that followed were a run of near-uninterrupted commercial dominance. Gibson followed Lethal Weapon with hits like Tequila Sunrise and its own sequel, and by 1990 was in such demand that he released 3 major films in a single year. Throughout the decade, he made a point of not letting himself be typecast as an action star, reportedly turning down the role of James Bond despite Sean Connery's personal encouragement, and instead alternating between crowd-pleasing comedies like What Women Want, family entertainment like Disney's Pocahontas, and heavier dramatic swings like his 1990 adaptation of Hamlet. By 2000, he was commanding a reported $25 million salary for The Patriot, and that same year both Chicken Run and What Women Want crossed the $100 million mark at the box office. 2 years later, Signs became, by some measures, the highest-grossing film of his acting career. At what looked like the absolute peak of his stardom, Gibson told reporters during that press tour that he was tired of being a movie star and would only take another acting role if the script was genuinely extraordinary. It wasn't an idle comment. Behind the scenes, Gibson had already been quietly building something else. A directing career, reportedly at the encouragement of studio executives who saw potential in him behind the camera as early as the late 1980s. He debuted in 1993 with The Man Without a Face, a modest effort that drew little attention. His second film changed that entirely. Braveheart, released in 1995, won him the Academy Award for Best Director and cemented him as a filmmaker with real ambition, not just a movie star playing at directing. He followed it a decade later with Apocalypto, another dialogue-sparse historical epic that, like The Passion of the Christ, reflected Gibson's evident fascination with brutal, immersive, language-authentic storytelling rather than conventional studio filmmaking. It was his third directorial effort, though, that would reshape the rest of his career, for better and for much, much worse. In 2004, Gibson released The Passion of the Christ, a brutal, unflinching depiction of the final 12 hours of Jesus' life, shot almost entirely in Aramaic and Latin with subtitles. No major studio wanted to touch the project, so Gibson financed it largely with his own money. The gamble paid off financially in a way almost nobody predicted. The film became the highest-grossing R-rated movie in American history at the time, pulling in hundreds of millions of dollars domestically alone. But the reception was anything but uniformly positive. Religious scholars and critics raised serious concerns about how the film portrayed Jewish characters, arguing that its depiction of a bloodthirsty mob calling for Jesus' death echoed centuries-old anti-Semitic tropes rather than historical or biblical accuracy. Historians also pointed out that the film took considerable creative liberties, inventing scenes with no scriptural basis, exaggerating the physical brutality far beyond what most theologians believe actually occurred, and taking dramatic license with details of dress, language, and appearance. The controversy became so heated that the Vatican was forced to issue a clarifying statement after reports circulated that Pope John Paul II had privately endorsed the film's accuracy, a claim the Vatican ultimately declined to confirm or deny outright. The film's violence alone was a talking point in its own right. Nearly the entire runtime is devoted to Jesus' torture and crucifixion, staged with a graphic intensity that critic Roger Ebert, among the film's more prominent reviewers, described as the most violent film he had personally ever seen. Audiences reportedly fainted, wept, and vomited in theaters, and at least one report circulated of a woman suffering a fatal heart attack during a screening. That combination, genuine box office phenomenon, genuine critical and religious controversy, and genuine physical audience reaction, made The Passion of the Christ one of the most talked-about films of the 2000s regardless of where any individual viewer landed on it. The human cost of that controversy fell hardest on Jim Caviezel, the actor who played Jesus. Before the film, Caviezel had been a rising star with credits including The Count of Monte Cristo. According to Caviezel himself, Gibson actually tried to talk him out of taking the role just 20 minutes after offering it to him, warning him bluntly that it could end his career. Caviezel took the part anyway, driven by his personal faith, and has said publicly that Hollywood largely turned its back on him afterward. He has never expressed regret about the decision. While The Passion of the Christ was making Gibson enormously wealthy, it was also setting the stage for what would become one of the most infamous nights of his life. In the early hours of July 28, 2006, a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy clocked a car speeding down the Pacific Coast Highway in Malibu at 87 miles per hour in a 4-to-5 zone. Behind the wheel was Mel Gibson. A breathalyzer test put his blood alcohol content at 0.12%, well over the legal limit, and he was placed under arrest for driving under the influence. What happened next turned a routine DUI arrest into a full-blown scandal. According to the arresting deputy's report, which was later leaked to the press, Gibson launched into a tirade laced with anti-Semitic remarks while being taken into custody, including comments blaming Jewish people for wars around the world. The story broke publicly within days, and the fallout was immediate and severe. Talent agencies distanced themselves, studio executives publicly questioned whether they could continue working with him, and commentators pointed out the grim irony of a man who had just directed one of the most religiously controversial films in modern history being accused of the exact prejudice critics had warned his movie might inflame. In the immediate aftermath, the story dominated entertainment news cycles for weeks, with commentators and Jewish advocacy organizations demanding a response from a man who, until that point, had built one of the most bankable public images in Hollywood. Gibson stayed almost entirely silent for months. When he finally spoke publicly about the arrest, it was in a sit-down interview with Diane Sawyer for ABC News that aired on October 10, 2006, a conversation that became must-watch television precisely because so few people expected Gibson to address the scandal head-on. In that interview, Gibson called his own remarks despicable and tried to explain them, without excusing them, as the incoherent ranting of a man deep in active alcoholism. He told Sawyer he understood why powerful people in the industry wanted nothing to do with him, and that their reaction, however painful, was entirely their right. He was candid about the fact that his career could evaporate overnight and said he had made peace with that possibility. What stood out most in the interview wasn't just the apology, it was Gibson's raw description of addiction itself. He told Sawyer that sobriety wasn't something you simply decide and maintain through willpower, that even the fear of losing everything you love isn't always enough to stop the pull of the disease, and that he had actually relapsed months before the arrest after years of staying clean. He described it as something that could ambush you out of nowhere, years of stability, and then someone hands you a drink, and every ounce of progress you'd built starts to unravel in seconds. That August, before the Sawyer interview aired, Gibson had already pleaded no contest to a misdemeanor charge of driving with an elevated blood alcohol level. He was sentenced to 3 years of probation and ordered into an alcohol rehabilitation program. It's worth pausing here on the scale of Gibson's family life, because it runs through nearly every chapter of his personal story. He and Robin Moore had 7 children together over the course of their 29-year marriage: Hannah and sons Edward, Christian, William, Louis, Milo, and Thomas. His relationship with Grigorieva added an 8th child, daughter Lucia, and his relationship with Rosalind Ross added a 9th, son Lars. Across 3 relationships and nearly 5 decades, Gibson has remained, by his own repeated public statements, someone who prioritizes fatherhood even when his romantic relationships have collapsed under intense public scrutiny. The 2006 arrest didn't just create a new scandal, it dragged old ones back into the light. In 2010, actress Winona Ryder gave an interview to GQ in which she claimed that roughly 15 years earlier, at a Hollywood party, an intoxicated Gibson had made a homophobic remark to a gay friend of hers and, upon learning she was Jewish, used an offensive slur referencing the Holocaust. Ryder said that when she tried to tell people in the industry about the incident at the time, in the 1990s, nobody believed her. She repeated the same account in a 2020 interview with the Sunday Times, and Gibson's representatives publicly and forcefully denied her allegations, calling them false. Ryder didn't back down, stating publicly that she stood by her account of the incident and wished Gibson well in whatever personal reckoning he might be going through, while making clear that she did not consider herself responsible for that reckoning. If 2006 was Gibson's public unraveling, 2010 delivered a second, arguably more damaging blow. By then, Gibson had already separated from Robin Moore, his wife of nearly 3 decades and the mother of his first 7 children, who filed for divorce in 2009. He quickly began a relationship with Russian musician Oksana Grigorieva, and the couple welcomed a daughter, Lucia, by the end of that year. The relationship deteriorated with startling speed. Grigorieva filed for a restraining order and accused Gibson of domestic violence, and shortly afterward, private audio recordings of the two of them in heated, ugly arguments were leaked to the media, capturing Gibson using abusive and threatening language. The recordings caused enormous damage to his public standing, arguably more than the 2006 arrest itself. Since this time, there was no ambiguity about the source. It was Gibson's own voice, caught in real time. Gibson later addressed the allegations directly, acknowledging that he had slapped Grigorieva once during an argument, while he denied that he had punched her or broken her teeth, saying a loose dental veneer had simply come off. The two were locked in custody and financial disputes for years afterward. His powerful talent agency dropped him as a client in the wake of the leaked recordings, and he was removed from the cast of The Hangover Part 2 after members of the production reportedly objected to his involvement. The legal fallout from the Grigorieva relationship stretched on for years, encompassing both a custody battle over Lucia and a financial settlement reportedly worth around $750,000, a portion of which Grigorieva ultimately forfeited after she was found to have violated the confidentiality terms of their agreement by discussing the relationship publicly. For several years, one of Hollywood's biggest leading men found himself relegated to supporting and villain roles in smaller action films, a sharp comedown for someone who a decade earlier had been commanding nine-figure box office grosses and eight-figure salaries. Industry commentators at the time openly speculated that Gibson's career as a leading man was permanently over, and for a while, the evidence supported that read. Major studios avoided him, awards bodies kept their distance, and the roles that did come his way were the kind that traded on his fall from grace rather than his talent. The rebuild, when it came, was gradual and, to many industry observers, unexpected. In 2016, Gibson directed Hacksaw Ridge, a World War II drama based on the true story of a combat medic who refused to carry a weapon. The film was a critical success, earned Gibson an Academy Award nomination for Best Director, and is widely regarded as the turning point that allowed him back into mainstream studio conversations after a decade largely spent on the industry's margins. The film earned 6 Academy Award nominations in total and won 2, and industry observers largely credited it with proving Gibson could still direct a major studio-backed production competently, professionally, and profitably, the thing that mattered most in a town that ultimately runs on box office receipts and award season prestige as much as on public sentiment. He continued building out Icon Productions, his production company, and served as an executive producer on 2023's Sound of Freedom, a film about human trafficking that became a surprise box office phenomenon, grossing well beyond its modest budget, while also becoming a lightning rod for its own set of political debates, both about the film's subject matter and about some of the conspiracy-adjacent commentary that grew up around its marketing and fan base. Whatever one makes of those debates, the film's commercial success reinforced something that had started to become clear after Hacksaw Ridge. Gibson, whatever the state of his public reputation, still had genuine commercial instincts as a producer and director, and a portion of the audience was more than willing to show up for his work regardless of the controversy trailing behind him. Gibson's personal life, meanwhile, had moved into a quieter chapter. In 2014, he began a relationship with equestrian-turned-screenwriter Rosalind Ross, and the couple had a son, Lars, in January 2017, a birth Gibson has said arrived just days before he learned of his Best Director Oscar nomination for Hacksaw Ridge. The relationship lasted nearly a decade, weathering the kind of ordinary hardship that rarely makes headlines. In January 2025, the couple lost their Malibu home in the devastating Los Angeles wildfires while Gibson was away working. Despite that shared loss, the relationship ended. Gibson and Ross announced in a joint statement in late December 2025 that they had quietly separated roughly a year earlier, saying they were focused on continuing to co-parent their son together. By that point, Gibson's public life had taken on an entirely different shape than it had in 2006. Ambassadors to Hollywood, tasked informally with helping bring film and television production back to California.